Good morning and welcome to SIS. My name is Carolyn Gallagher and I am the Senior Associate Dean here in the building. And it's so lovely to have all of you here in an early morning too. It's really my pleasure today to welcome you to this particular event, SIS Ambassadors Up Close, Women in Diplomacy. This is sponsored by SIS and also our Transatlantic Policy Center. And honestly, I can't think of a better way to kickstart Women's History Month than this event. So I want to introduce you now to today's panelists, but before I do, I want you to know that they're all very distinguished people with very long and great careers. So there's no way I can capture all of that here. So please recognize that I'm giving you some snapshots. So I want to start by introducing Geraldine Byrne-Nason. She's Ireland's ambassador to the US. Previously, she was the ambassador and permanent representative of Ireland to the UN between 2017 and 22. And while there, she led Ireland's successful campaign for a seat on the UN Security Council. She's also served as Ireland's ambassador to France, the second Secretary General in the Department at the Taoiseach, and also ambassador and Ireland's deputy permanent representative to the EU. I'm also happy to introduce you to Christina Markus Lassen, who is Denmark's ambassador to the US. Previously, she held the position of political director and undersecretary for political affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Denmark, the EU ambassador to Lebanon, and the ambassador of Denmark to Syria and to Jordan. This is also not Ambassador Lassen's first service here in the US. Between 2000 and 2004, she was the first secretary in the political department at the Embassy of Denmark in Washington, DC. So welcome back. Our next guest is Mariangela Zappia, who was Italy's ambassador to the United States. She is a career diplomat with over 35 years of experience. She is the first woman in her country to hold this position. Previously, she was the first woman permanent representative of Italy to the UN and to NATO. And she has also been the first woman diplomatic advisor to the Italian Prime Minister and a G7, G20 Sherpa. And I do want to say we do a model G20 here in SIS, and that is a hard job. Our students say that. And our moderator, cannot forget our moderator, Michelle Egan, who is a stellar human being and one of my favorite colleagues. She's, of course, a professor here in SIS, and she's the co-director with Garrett Martin of the school's Transatlantic Policy Center. Professor Egan is an expert on comparative politics and political economy in Europe and the US, with a focus on issues of federalism, trade, governance, and law. She's also the past chair of the EU Studies Association and an editor of a series on EU with Palgrave. It's a stellar group. I'm going to turn it over to Michelle.
I'd like to invite the ambassadors, please. Gosh, welcome everyone here. We have a good crowd in person, but we also have a live stream as well. So we have a number of people listening online across the United States. So we're very delighted to be here. It's really a privilege to be here with very accomplished female ambassadors at the start of Women's History Month. So I'm going to ask a couple of general questions related to public diplomacy, and then I will ask some specific, more foreign policy, transatlantic relations questions. And have to start off with a question because of Women's History Month. You know, women are increasingly taking on high-profile roles in foreign policy, EU VP, foreign leaders, and also yourselves. There's been increasingly a focus on gender in diplomatic activities. How does being a senior woman diplomat, female ambassador, play a role in your public diplomacy? I'm happy to invite all three of you to address the question. would you like to start? And we'll do it different ways.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be. This is my maiden voyage here to the campus, so I'm delighted to be here. And on a very auspicious occasion, nothing gets me as enthusiastic as talking about women and gender and foreign policy. So thank you for inviting me. Look, a couple of things, if I may say at the top about women in diplomacy, women in public policy in general. You know, I went to university in 1978. That was just 4 years after the Irish government lifted what we called a marriage bar on professional women. So if you were a public servant, a woman in the Foreign Service, for example, and married, you had to resign. So when I joined the Foreign Service in the early 80s, we had one female ambassador at the time. So one, if you can't see it, you can't be it, one role model. Today, 50% of Ireland's foreign service is female-led, so female operations led across the globe. Half of our ambassadors are women, so that is a long way to have come. On the other hand, it's been a patchy and bumpy road to get there, and I don't want to present it as in any way a fait accompli. I'm the 19th ambassador to the US for my country. I'm just the second woman. So, you know, we don't have a record that I'm trying to present as a model to anyone. What I will say, on the other hand, is that we have managed in that pathway to get to women in a diplomatic profile, but decision-making role. I think that's an important distinction that we just don't want to showcase. We want women in the room, at the table, in diplomacy, making decisions and leading negotiations. To get there, we've had to rely on clearing, you know, obstacles that were systemic, obstacles that were constitutional. I've mentioned Mary Robinson as one of the 2 female presidents of Ireland. Just an example of what she engaged with, I think, expresses how bumpy the pathway to get to where we are today was. She espoused the legalization of contraception in Ireland. That was illegal while I was at university, just to clarify things. The decriminalization of homosexuality. She helped pave the way for a constitutional reform on divorce and on abortion, issues that matter to women in public life. But diplomats are a reflection of their society. I'm reflecting my society. So just to say, we've had a long, hard climb to get here, but we're in a much better space. 2 last points, if I may, on my own reflections on women in diplomacy. One of under the jobs, I guess, I've had that was most precious to me in my career was just recently when I led the team on the Security Council. We made a huge effort to be the lead on women, peace and security at the Security Council table. I think the role of women internationally, the role of women in diplomacy is a matter of international security. I think it's a matter that relates to the delivery of climate justice. It relates to the delivery of disarmament and the broader women in disarmament agenda, to which I'm also attached. On the other hand, I will tell you, at the Security Council, arguing for women and their role in the broader security framework is one of the most toxic issues. So we can maybe get back to that in the Q&A. And then the last thing I will say is I salute those countries, Ireland not yet, that have introduced feminist foreign policy programs. You know, I think it's often misleading to look at this in a way about the individual women delivering on the policy. For me, certainly after my time at the UN, and I chaired the Commission on the Status of Women, it's about women's approach to solving problems. And the women in Northern Ireland were a prime example of that when we negotiated Good Friday Agreement 25 years ago. They battled their way literally to the table. It was their angle of entry into security and peace on the ground in communities, cross community education, victims, etc., that made the difference. So it's an angle of entry in policy that makes a difference.
It's a wonderful introduction to Women's History Month. Would you like to pick up on that as well? Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for having me together with my colleagues for this conversation. It's great for me to be in the American University. It's my first time here. I love to talk to young audiences because, and I make my earlier remark more personal than what Geraldine just did, because I discovered how important it is to keep talking about how difficult still is for women to get in the position where we are. My personal experience is that when I got into the Foreign Service, and this is more or less when Geraldine did, this was the beginning of the 80s, I did it without really thinking what I was going in. I didn't really think a lot about this career and what would have been for a woman to do it, for me to do it. And it is a fantastic career, by the way. So if you're thinking about embracing it, I certainly encourage you to do it. But I didn't at all realize the number of obstacles that I would have encountered. And those obstacles are in part solved now after almost 40 years. I got into the service in 1983, so I'm in my 40 years of diplomatic career, but some are still there. I'm very jealous of the number that Geraldine just mentioned. In my system, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we still are only 25% women. Only 30% more or less each year are women that get into the career. So we are still we still have a problem of numbers. And well, I think we will get back to that, but I think the issue of numbers is a very important issue. So when I got into the career, as I said, I didn't think about that. After 40 years, I think that numbers matters, and that any policy that is conceived to get more women in careers, so to be very open with the language, quotas, I now believe in quotas. I now believe that we need positive action because otherwise parity is something that we will reach only following the UN estimation in almost 200 years, which is a little bit too much to me. Ready to go back to policy issues, but I just wanted to say that the situation is better for sure. But there is still a lot to do, and I believe in positive action for parity. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I can say it's really nice to be back at AU because unlike my colleagues, I actually studied here. This has been, I don't know, something a little more than 30 years ago. I was here for the Washington semester program doing foreign policy. And very much like Mariangela said, it wasn't super, at least for me, it wasn't super planned, but clearly I was attracted to this foreign policy piece. So I feel a little bit today like these little memes where you say, this is how it was, or how it was, how it's going. And I can say that I hadn't really thought about that here 30 years ago, that I would sit up here as Denmark's ambassador. And that's just really cool, actually, to think about. So great to be back. And again, just a lot of same kind of reflections. I mean, we have some trailblazers here. I started a little bit later in the service, but still, I think I've experienced so many of these same things, not really reflecting about what would it mean to be a woman in this business, as so many other businesses, by the way, or jobs, but realizing that it's just not, it wasn't that obvious. And especially, when you go into the fields of sort of security policy, national security, conflict management, you just realize that you end up finding yourself very often as the only woman in the room. And it's, again, it's not something I necessarily thought so much about over the years, but in recent years, when there are suddenly more women in the room, I actually really notice how much better that is, because of all the obvious reasons. We know that it's just
so much better for decision making when there are more diversity around the table. And even though we all know that and understand that rationally, it hasn't really affected very much. So at least it's been quite slow. But I think we've seen some real progress in last year. And just the fact, and we were talking about that in another event yesterday, actually, just when I was then, as I was said in the introduction, I was posted here at our embassy as my first junior job, staffer job at the embassy, a little more than 20 years ago. And at that point, there was one woman ambassador, at least among the EU 28, and probably not that many outside that group. Today, we're about 47, so just under 50. So it's better. It's not so great. We still think we should have parity, but it's not about that. But it does feel different when there are more women around. And so in that sense, I think we've seen a lot of progress over the last few years, but we still have a long way to come. And it's interesting because I think the older we all get, we seem to all come to the conclusion that actually quotas is not such a bad idea. It's not something we used in my country. We have tended to believe that things would evolve naturally, and we do have a pretty good gender parity in most sectors, including in government. But there has just been also realization, exactly as also was stated before, that some of these processes are just going to take too long if we're going to wait for it to happen naturally. Except for one example is on professional private business boards. We still have a very low number, around 15% women on the boards. So we've actually, as of this year, introduced also quotas for female representation on boards. And again, it's something that we don't necessarily like, but could be a good temporary measure for some years until we naturalize that situation. But in any case, great to be here and great to be back at AU.
Thank you. Wonderful insights from your career. You're also here, and one of the most important issues is certain policy issues, and specifically the transatlantic relationship is a key focus of your role here. And I wondered if I could ask just two questions that would be probably on the minds of students of international affairs. And the first one is security and Ukraine. So we're 1 year into the conflict, and so supporting Ukraine is fast becoming a partisan issue in the United States, or a partisan subject. How challenging is it going to be to maintain public support for helping Ukraine in your respective countries? And what do you think a fair and negotiated solution would look like? I'm wondering would you like to start? So
the first thing I like to say is that if there is one case where this transatlantic relation has been proved really core to what we are as countries, is the Ukrainian situation, the aggression of Russia to Ukraine. I think one of the miscalculation that the Russian regime did was that we would have been divided by in the way we would have responded to this aggression. It was a big miscalculation. In fact, one of the major results of this is really our unity, our transatlantic unity, the way together we have decided to support Ukraine. And I come to your second question, to support Ukraine to the negotiating table that Ukraine think is the right one. So unless and until we don't see how Ukraine independence, sovereignty, right to be a country in its own natural border, if we don't see where is the solution to guarantee those conditions, I think we won't be ready to negotiate as countries that are supporting Ukraine. So it's very strong. It's something that doesn't belong only to Ukraine. It's really something that we are, something that talks to the future of our democracies, basically. It's about that. It's about the systems of values and principles that we have chosen long time ago after the Second World War, and is in a way validated today, but is brutal aggression. This is what we have to defend. So by defending and supporting Ukraine, we are in fact defending and supporting ourselves, our democracies, our principle, and the way we like to live. And I will stop here.
Very much agree. I think if anyone had started over the years to take the transatlantic relationship a little bit for granted, the situation with the Russian invasion was certainly a wake-up call for everyone, and extremely quickly realized how important that relationship is, and that only by acting together could we really help what needs to be done here, which is support Ukraine in every possible way. And that's just been extraordinary. And the pace with, I completely agree with Mariangela, the way it went so natural from the beginning, and the pace with which we were coordinating was just incredible. Largely thanks to this amazing, smart strategy of the American government of sharing intel even before the invasion, which meant that we were all prepared. We had a hard time believing this was really going to happen because it was so counterintuitive. But when it happened, we had already had long discussions. We were ready to coordinate our sanctions, weapons donations, everything that came in the months after. And it's just been extraordinary. You were asking if it's a partisan thing. At least I can say in my country, it's not. It's a complete agreement from left to right in parliament and in the whole population that this is an existential battle for us about everything we believe in, our European values, the rules, international rule-based order, everything existential at stake here, and we want to go all the way and help Ukraine in this battle. But I think it's also been really encouraging to see, and of course, one hand, the transatlantic cooperation of this, but also the unity within Europe. We're very often asked over here, so when is Europe going to crack? It's great that you stuck together for so long, but when are you guys going to, like you always do, start hesitating? And I have to say, so far, we don't actually see any of that. That has been also extraordinary since the very first day of the invasion. Our heads of state and government came together at the same night in a meeting in Brussels. I was there accompanying my prime minister. And the unity in that room, where they actually had President Zelensky on a video call with them in there, that room, when Kiev was being bombed on the first day, was just extraordinary. That's when we already passed the first sanction package this week, which is passed sanctions package number 10. But of course, there have been so many other extraordinary developments throughout this past year, not always with full agreement. We're 27 quite different countries. And for some countries, this is also, we're paying a lot here, not paying in terms of so many things, not just financially. But these are difficult considerations for all of this, for a lot of countries. And every time we'd actually managed to work these differences out and get together and have a joint policy on that, which has been incredible. And again, just to underline how much this is a war that's in our neighborhood. It's a 2-hour flight from my capital, Copenhagen, where the front is right now. And I think that really, of course, has an impact. And it has an impact that's probably a little bit more tangible than here, in sense of the closeness, in terms of the refugees that we have all received, about 8 million Ukrainian refugees now around Europe. In terms of the inflation rates, we have had inflation in my country. That's something I've never experienced anything like that in my lifetime, but that's been the case in all of Europe. And of course, energy prices, so many other things. So there are a lot of consequences of this war, but everybody just takes it as, for now, obviously it's going to wear down and tear down in the longer run. But so far, everybody's taking it as a natural price to pay when we see how the Ukrainians are suffering.
Look, I mean, what my two colleagues have said is describes it. I was sitting at the Security Council on the night of the 23rd of February, when none of us actually still believed this was going to happen, and all of our initial statements were appeals to the Russians not to do it, not to invade Ukraine. Clearly, those appeals fell on deaf ears as the invasion happened as we were at the table. Easily for me, the most shocking moment in my diplomatic career. But I don't think I was alone in that. And I don't think the Russian delegation sitting 2 desks away from me knew what was about to happen. But, a couple of points, if I may. One, I think the point that both Mariangela and Christina have made about our backyard is important. I mean, this is something we in Europe never thought we would see, war on the continent of Europe. A nuclear power, a permanent member of the Security Council, tearing up the rule book, an affront to all of the values, all of the international laws that we hold dear to, that we live by, just literally thrown out overnight by this invasion. So, you know, it has been a sort of a tectonic plate shift in geopolitical relations. But I know President Biden usually says it's never a good bet to bet against the American people. It's never now a good bet to bet against EU-US in this, giving this example of what we can do together. And when we get to talk about trade, I think we shouldn't forget the link between peace and prosperity and how critical it is that we stay in lockstep as partners on this. In Ireland now, you know, we have 1% of our population is Ukrainian, and that happened in the last 11 months. So we have young Ukrainian kids in schools in the southwest of Ireland playing Irish football, doing Irish dancing. They're in the labour market, immediately integrated. You know, they are people in need. As Irish people, we know what that feels like. So we have been delighted to bring them home, and there is home as into Ireland. And, you know, it is, as in Denmark, you mentioned, it's a cross-party support. There is no waning, it's an unwavering commitment. And I will say behind that, Ireland has also been very strong in advocating for Ukraine to become an EU member. It is a member of our European family on the European continent. EU membership brings big responsibilities. It's a complex process, but there's a pathway for Ukraine. And I think for the Ukrainian people, that's important. I'll just say one last thing, because I'm often asked, both Denmark and Italy are members of NATO. Ireland is militarily unaligned, but we are never neutral on principle or on values. And we have been a fully active participant in the war effort, qua member of the European Union. We don't fund lethal force, but we are involved in training Ukrainian troops. The EU has launched a mission, what's it called, a military action mission. I can't remember if that's the correct title, but we have our own defence forces helping there, working on demining. Protective gear is provided by Ireland. We're providing food to the Ukrainian troops. And I saw that the Secretary General of NATO just recently asked about the progress of the war. We're always taking snapshots of who's where, but he made an interesting point that right now we're in a big, serious logistical phase of this war. So what's needed is fuel, what's needed is medical support. So, you know, we certainly as Ireland involved in all of that hands-on practical support to Ukraine. And I have to say, I think that the moral support that they've received is a reflection of what Christina finished up on, this idea that we are actually on a pathway here to protect democracy for all of us. No matter how far away you are from the front line, democracy is at stake. And we see the European Union, the sanctions, which have, sanctions are always debatable. An Irishman, some of you may know from here, David O'Sullivan, is now the EU envoy on the implementation of the sanctions against Russia. But when you talk about a 10th package of sanctions, there's over 100 names on that list. People involved in the Wagner Group, people involved in the, nefarious activities. Big banks that haven't been gone after before. We're getting really down to the bone now in terms of what will hurt this effort. And I think that's an important thing to say. And, I did mention Iran there in passing. Iran is picked up in this set of sanctions, as is, of course, Syria and Belarus from the past. So these are hardcore actions agreed between the EU and the US and being rolled out in Europe with full vigor and energy. So the effort is very serious and for very good cause.
Gosh, that was for the audience, a complete comprehensive set of answers covering security, foreign policy, trade, refugees. It really does give you an impact of the intersectional of issues here. I'm going to shift to the other big issue that's often talked about in Washington, particularly with the new U.S. Select Committee on China. And obviously, the EU at one point called China a systemic rival, and there's been an increase of national security and trade issues. And the EU has also put on, a lot of defensive measures, anti-coercion, investment screening. And so how are you working with the United States in terms of reducing risk, and whether it's the intersection of national security and trade, whether it is concern about, market practices? How do you work with the United States in this area? Or maybe you will allude to the TTC, the Trade and Technology Council. What is the thinking here in terms of China?
China is obviously almost as much discussed in the city as Russia these days. And that's, of course, also when you see the administration's national security strategy, it identifies Russia as the sort of immediate threat to everything we believe in and stand for, and democratic values, but also China is the more long-term strategic challenge to the US. And I think there's, to a high degree, a lot of divergence in convergence, I think it's called, between Europe and America on this. And there has been also a major development that you were saying very correctly. A few years ago, back in 2019, Europe did sort of a new strategic framework for how we look at China. Was more, before it had been more been as a partner. We added these two words, and you were mentioning one of them. One was competitor and one was systemic rival, because obviously there was a lot of challenges that we see in the way we deal with China, which has very much been an economic relationship, but we just realized that the value part was missing, and also, of course, that they were also not necessarily level playing field that our companies were competing on. And then I think several other developments in the last few years have been maybe making us a little bit more clear-eyed. Probably the COVID pandemic contributed to that, where some of the reactions and actions we saw from the Chinese side just made people reflect a little bit more about our investments and the need to have also protect our supply chains, basically, and not be too dependent on one market or production field. So there's a lot of convergence, I think, between very strong convergence, actually, between the American and European analysis. Sometimes we discuss how to go about these things, but again, I think on an overall level, everybody seems to pretty much agree. Nobody's talking about a total decoupling from China, because we're just too intertwined. This is not something you do in a globalized economy, even though there might be some setbacks for globalization. We are, of course, still all extremely dependent. My country, for one, is really an export-driven economy. So nobody wants to close down anything, but there's probably more talk about de-risking and thinking about, as I was saying before, some of those strategic supply chains, and just thinking about how you work on those. And that's exactly the kind of things we can do with the TTC, which has really been an excellent mechanism for Europe and for the EU and the US to discuss lots of very concrete issues, for example, with CHIPS Acts and some of the challenges we have on both sides of the Atlantic. How do we work together about some of those production and supply chain challenges? And I think I was missing my point. Well, in particular, on the supply chain side, we've also, of course, there's been the whole question now of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which, in spite this little bit strange name, actually is about climate. So it's a big, huge climate package, which fundamentally we love, because we're very happy to see the US engage so directly on fulfilling its climate ambitions, and it's something that's really going to make a huge impact for climate, for slowing down climate change on a global level. So that's all good. There's also a lot of stuff in there that's about how we also ensure some of those technologies, and also, especially when we do the green transition, again, making sure that we don't become dependent on a new one single supplier like we've seen in Europe a little bit on the energy dependency on Russia. We don't want the same thing to happen with some of those new climate technologies being totally dependent on one other country. But of course, that's where some of the debate has been between Europe and America right now, or the EU and the US. How do we do that in a way that we just coordinate this and do it so we don't start undermining each other's companies or markets, or we don't start undermining basically innovation and technology on between us, between the friends and allies. And that's another, again, the TTC is a great venue to have those discussions. And there's already been a lot of adjustments in the way this packet, this new huge important IRA package is going to be implemented. So we need to continue having those discussions, because if it is, of course, in our joint interest as Europe and America that we work together on some of these huge challenges we are facing in the new order of global competition.
Look, I absolutely 100% agree with everything Christina said. Let's be clear, this is very complex. Dealing with China, we call them our partner, our competitor, our strategic systemic rival. The EU likes to call it multifaceted. Certainly from Ireland's perspective, we're a small, one of the most open economies in the world, but we don't separate trade from our values and principles. So this is the complex range of issues that we deal with as we look to working with China. We believe in a one China policy, one legitimate Chinese government. But, you know, having said that, there are a range of challenges in there. I can mention Tibet, Taiwan, human rights, Xinjiang, Hong Kong. This is a relationship that's very complex and that really can't only be looked at through a trade prism. The relationship is much more broad-based. But I might just say two other things. One comes from my just background at the Security Council in New York and what we've just said about Ukraine. We need to be careful internationally how we deal with Russia and China. And the last thing we want to do is to back them into a corner together and to have them form a strategic alliance that makes the groundwork for this wonderful transatlantic relationship we have even more complex. I think we need to box clever. You know, I saw that China was hesitant at the beginning of the Security Council when Russia invaded Ukraine. I think it's publicly debated how comfortable China is. Sovereignty is a big issue for China, as we all know. And this is a complete affront to sovereignty, what's going on in Ukraine. You know, I know that the US has spoken publicly recently about the risk, maybe the reality, we don't know, that China is directly supporting the effort in Ukraine. That will not be a direction that would be good for any of our relationships. So I think we just need to look at this in the round and make sure that we are, certainly as Europeans, and I know my own country, that we're very clear-eyed about our relationships, but that we're not closing off pathways geostrategically that could be very important. Second point I'll make is that I saw both China and Russia making huge steps globally in terms of their relationships, particularly in Africa. And China is very well established geostrategically, geopolitically, in places in some former colonial venues where France or the UK wouldn't have been welcome. The US at times, and I'll be honest about this, took the eye off the ball, and China has moved in. And so there's a very strong Chinese offer globally that we also need to keep an eye to. So I say those things by way of just saying this isn't, it's certainly no question of, as the Chinese like to say, win-win. There's no zero-sum game here. It's a very complex issue. And I think the range of views within the European Union on this actually help us to be very rounded in the way we're responding and dealing with China. We see China, yes, we see them as a competitor. We work with them as a partner in some areas, and they are a rival. But the discussion with the United States is an excellent one, and I think we will continue that.
Well, it's difficult for me to add more, but maybe starting precisely from how we define our relation with China in the European Union. So we still believe that China has to be a partner in some of the biggest challenges that we are all faced to. Climate is just probably the biggest one. So understanding that there is a partnership there that has to work if we have to really defend our planet from climate change and find solutions that are common solutions. So yes, China has to be considered a partner on some issues. And I think also the American administration is looking at where there are areas in which the cooperation with China is benefiting all of us. Then is a competitor, and that's very clear for all of us. Is a huge competitor with huge means, a huge market for all of us. And this is something that we cannot deny. As European, we don't deny that. And as Christina was saying, we are all, in a way, even competing among ourselves for that market, because it's a huge market destined to grow even bigger. But in competing with China, we need to protect ourselves, and this is something that has been, I think COVID in this case, another crisis that was very useful in a way. COVID showed us how dependent we were from China for very basic things, from the mask that we all know were and still are all Chinese. Ventilators. So the thing that we needed the most at the very beginning, we were dependent from China on that, and that's just an example. We discovered how dependent we are on basic daily needs from that country, and this was a wake-up call that we need to rebuild our own industrial base. And in doing that, the mistake could be, and this was a little bit the tendency at the beginning after the COVID crisis, the tendency could be to be protective, so rebuilding our industries while protecting our industries. In the European Union, we believe that we need to reason in terms of our 27 countries. I believe there is a lesson there, and I come to the relation with the US, our transatlantic relation. I believe that there is an opportunity also for the transatlantic relation to grow in a way that is more thinking as an area, also economically, and not only politically. So it's not only about political unity of intent, but it's also about our economies. And so I believe that there is now a very healthy discussion, not only in the TTC, but in a task force that was created to understand, for instance, how the IRA is going to impact on the European industry. I think this is a very beneficial discussion because, very frankly, there are protectionist part of this bill that are creating issues in Europe, and have created also a discussion among us. So this is to say that competition with China showed us our weaknesses, but also a way to build our transatlantic relation even more also on cooperation on economic and industrial issues. And the third thing, China is a rival because China advocate for a different system of values, and I think we really need to understand that. And as Geraldine, I have worked in the UN, I have worked in the G20, and the model that China tries to push, if you want, in remodeling the world in this shifting of globalization, of model of globalization that we are living in is not our model. And the last thing I would like to say is that a lot of this rivalry is playing right now on technology and innovation. And these are two areas where our partnership, Europe and the US, is so important. The technology and innovation can be used in a way that is beneficial to our society, but they can be very dangerous for our society at the same time. And I think this is what we have to defend. Last thing, all of us have adopted means to protect from China predatory investments. In Italy, we have a law, we called it Golden Power, is being very useful. We have understood, and it comes to my mind because of technology and innovation, we have understood that even in things that you don't think are related to this predatory, in a way, philosophy that is at the base of some of the Chinese way of keeping control of our industry, are not so natural. For instance, I'm thinking of agriculture and how you discover all of a sudden that an acquisition has an objective that is to stall your intellectual property. In the sense you rate your grain. So it's really something that is very general. We need to protect our systems, and technology and innovation is really where this rivalry is playing, to me, the major role.
Gosh, thank you. I'm not going to monopolize any further because you've given us so much food for thought, and I would like to open it up to questions. We're going to have students line up very briefly here using my microphone. You may address one particular ambassador, Ambassador Zappia, Ambassador Byrne-Nason, or Ambassador Markus Lassen. Please keep the question short, and we will collect 2 or 3 at a time, just so that we can use sort of 10, 15 minutes to answer and raise some questions. Please line up. Please keep it short. This is not going to be easy.
All right. Well, thank you for all the valuable insights. My name is Claudia Koja. I'm a PhD candidate in political science, visiting from Salzburg, Austria. My question is, what do you think are the persistent obstacles for women in diplomacy? And what would you say is your personal contribution to paving the way for women in diplomacy? And I want to clarify, I do believe in collective.
Just one question.
Well, I'm sorry, I just need to. Oh, just one question. Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't know. Then I was. But could I be brief on the because it's the other point is related to the conflict in Ukraine, and it's been a momentum for many people to claim that there's been a differentiation between like how we treat refugees from the different war countries, and so how would you interpret that? And would you say that women may offer alternative perspectives or approaches to war and conflict resolution? And I was referring to the comparison earlier, Ukraine conflict, Israel, Palestine, Syrian case and all that. Thank you.
Hi, I'm just wondering, as the percentage of women has increased in international policy and they are now making decisions, how has the international response to humanitarian crises and human rights crises, such as the Yemeni conflict, the Uyghur Muslims, that sort of thing?
take the last one and then we'll have you give a chance to respond. You can see that there's a lot of questions.
I wanted
Feel
to,
free to take the more, sorry, please feel free to take the ones that you would like to address.
ask a question about, you were mentioning earlier how the potential for China and Russia to form a relation, and how do you think through transatlantic policy, and especially the role of women in transatlantic policy, can help to make sure there isn't an isolation between two global powers?
Well, maybe I'll kick off with the question about humanitarian and human rights. Have women and their participation in diplomacy made a difference? My straightforward answer would be yes. I'm not sure how we can quantify that, but I can say that in the work that I've been doing, certainly on foreign policy in the last 15 or 20 years, we have front-loaded the humanitarian aspects of security or foreign policy. I think it's an important aspect to, let's take one concrete example, current situation in Afghanistan, where we've seen a horrendous security situation and response. We have an abuse of women's rights on the ground, but we're dealing with the fundamentally critical humanitarian context as well. And there are tensions within that in diplomacy. And I must say, I found myself of very divided mind, the degree to which you can deliver humanitarian policy to the Taliban, support for humanitarian action, while they are at the same time withdrawing fundamental rights in terms of education to women. So I think having women involved in a discussion like that is absolutely fundamental. And I will say, while we were on the council, we battled hard to ensure that there was a critical analysis of that humanitarian response. I see somebody in the front row who seems to know a little bit about that, smiling. So that's a coded answer from me on that. The other one of the other questions, I'll just touch on the persistent obstacles for women in diplomacy, and how have I tried to pave the way for other women. I'll just say one concrete thing. There are many persistent obstacles, and I think Mariangela and Christina both said none of us could have invented those when we started out. Some of them you don't see coming. Some of them are attitudinal, and that's very hard to quantify. And even still to this day, I think even at our great elevated status as ambassadors to the United States, we could give you examples of where attitudinally in our own service and in the international environment, women are sometimes given a sort of a prototypical role or response. One thing I've always said to young women beginning their careers in diplomacy who have asked me, I'm the mother of one child, how do you do child, marriage and career? I've always advocated that we look at our careers, at least I have looked at my career in a different way. I left the Foreign Service to work on an international platform on a number of occasions. I left to work at the OECD for a number of years. As it happened, I married a diplomat. He was serving in our embassy in Paris at the time, but I made my career matter at the OECD. And when I went back into the Foreign Ministry again, moved to the Prime Minister's office as his Secretary General, I made that matter. So I say to young women that there are modular approaches to taking a role, delivering on it, and summing it up and building it into your next step. There's a tendency in the traditional career path of my male colleagues, I'll just leave it at that, to be very, there's a greasy pole there that I've never regarded as one I had to climb, and it hasn't done me any harm. Thanks.
Shall I? So the role of women in diplomacy and how do I see my role? I'm a strong believer in mentorship, first thing. I didn't have any mentor, very frankly. I was the only woman in my competition in my Concord in my year in 1983. I have remained the only woman for a long time. I didn't have examples. And I believe strongly in that. So what I do, I try to mentor not only women colleagues, but also young men colleagues, because in the end, this is about all of us. Is not a is not women against men. Is really creating a more equal society, and this will benefit in the end all of us. And so I simply made them think of processes that come naturally, simply because of how the society is composed, the reality of the society. So I take very, very practical example. When we organize an event in the embassy, you need to find speakers, you need to find panelists, and all of a sudden you end up with a long list of men. And this is not because you are choosing the men, but it's because if you open, I don't know, if you Google a site and you ask who are the major scientists on this issue, or the most important political commentators on another issue, the list is very often a list of men. This is the way our society is working. So the effort that we do is, and I push them, when I see the list of panelists and I see too many men, I said, well, is it possible that there are no women that are dealing with this issue? So go back, please, and let's see if there are interesting women that can contribute to the conversation. And all of a sudden, the women come, and the women are there, and there are very interesting women that are dealing with that issue. So this is something that I do really systematically, and I believe these are the little things that can change our environment. There are things that I did in my life that are now I'm discovering are examples for other women. I took a long leave in my career, 4 years, because at one point I was struggling. 2 kids. My husband was a international organization officer, so he had a similar career, moving all the time, the difficulty to be together, the kids, the school, the change. At one point I thought this is going to just blow up, and I stopped. And it was the most difficult decision I took in my life, because I am a career person, so I want my career to be successful, and I wanted that. But I took that decision, and in the end, it was the greatest decision of my life. It was good for my kids. It was good for me. And in the end, here I am. I didn't do I did a quite successful career. So it's possible. And I see how many young colleagues look at that 4 years in my CV, where I put that I was on leave, on family leave, to take care of my kids. I put it on purpose. So there are things that I believe we should do every day that are small, but they are big at the same time. And what can we do in our transatlantic community in terms of how we guarantee that there is equal opportunities for all? I think we're all doing something. I think there is a lot more to do, and I take my country as an example, and I have few numbers here. The Bank of Italy very recently issued a report. Women occupation, employment in my country is 51.3% only, I would say. And the estimation is that if women employed would be 60% of the population, of women population, our GDP will be 7% higher, 7% higher. I take this and I put it in the European perspective, and then on the transatlantic perspective. And I believe that if we all work for that, target of, I think, 75%, that in some countries, like I think Denmark, is working and is happening, I believe there will be a huge push to our economies as transatlantic community too. I stop here.
No, thanks a lot for those questions. And I think some of it, I mean, I just very much agree with what also has been said already. Yes, there are persistent challenges for women in diplomacy. I think we can just almost leave it at that. I think it has a lot to do with attitude still that we're confronted with, but that's not just in our line of work. I think that's many places where women just have to work a little harder and be a little bit more better prepared and all of that, just because there's some certain stereotypes we have to overcome first when we arrive to the room. But that's not just for diplomacy. I think also in this particular business, and Mariangela was just mentioning the whole challenge of having to move a lot around, uproot your family a lot. It's still today, even in my country, where I think we have a pretty good record on gender parity, it is still harder for women diplomats to get their husband to quit his job, but maybe not the first time, maybe not the second if they're lucky, but the third and fourth and fifth is just really hard. And that tends to be a little easier, but not that's changing too, actually, at least in Denmark. It's a little easier for our male colleagues to get the family to move around, but also since we have a very high degree of women participation in the labor force also in Denmark, it's actually becoming more and more complicated for our male colleagues. So it's more of an equal problem now, but it's certainly a challenge in our specific line of work. In terms of being paving the way for other women, I think hopefully just the fact that women see that it's possible to have these kind of position, being decision makers, that's important. Not just in our countries, because again, in Denmark, that's maybe more obvious in the US as well. I served a lot in the Middle East, and I hope at least that I also could inspire someone over there. That's at least what I heard from a lot of the women and girls whenever I went somewhere or did a talk or engaged with people. I had another maybe kind of connection, at least always often lots of women and girls wanting to talk to me about how we did that, and that was possible for a woman. I think that's the kind of things that having more women in these kind of positions is also very important. And of course, and that leads also, there was a question about women, peace and security. Again, I don't think it's something we really knew this concept maybe 15 years ago, or very much Secretary Clinton, there was a lot of work in the UN at the time. This has just been a whole new area of focus. And even though we're certainly not where we'd like to be, the focus on having women included in peace processes and reconstruction and reconciliation processes, at least the focus is there, and we're always pushing for it. We're certainly not seeing in Afghanistan right now. It's probably the worst example. We've seen other places where we see women much more involved in a lot of the popular uprisings over the last 10, 15 years. I saw it in Syria. We've seen it in many places in the Middle East. They tend to be sadly crowded out as things turn more violent, and then suddenly disappear when they start being the power struggle really happens around the negotiating tables. But that's exactly why we need to continue pushing for them to be present, because we have to reconstruct these societies with women being part of the table. We had an interesting discussion last night with the ambassador of Rwanda, who basically explained how that did happen in Rwanda after the horrible situation they had about 20 years ago. And 30 years ago, sorry, and basically how women, both by constitutional changes, legal changes, became so much more, lots of quotas, part of that whole discussion and debate in the reconstruction of Rwandan society. And they have a situation now actually with 65% women in parliament, which is better than any of us up here, I think. So.
Could you keep your question very short and we'll collect them all if that's possible? I think there are 4 people waiting, so would we mind doing all 4? If you have a particular ambassador, please direct. Thank you so much for the extra time.
Thank you. Understandably so, Ukraine has become a central focus at the time. But even before that, some people worry that because of commercial interests with China, sometimes when we talk about pushing Russia and China into the corner, we're hesitant to call out China, but we call out Russia very easily. And since the ambassador from Ireland mentioned the one China principle, I want to ask all of you, is China the biggest threat we face in the world right now, long term? And is Taiwan an independent country?
hard time. A hard time beating that question. It was a good question, but I guess what I would ask is kind of a more boring question, right? To the Italian ambassador, we talk a lot about kind of national differences in terms of with respect to like conflict within the EU. So one country wants to do one thing, another country wants to do another thing. But we talk less about regional differences. In the case of Italy, I mean, northern Italy, if you've been to Milan, is very different than southern Italy, like Naples or whatever. Like these are two very different places in the same country. I guess like what role does that play in broader EU politics and affairs?
I have a question for Ambassador Zappia. So, I'm sorry. When talking about the aid to Ukraine and the government's stance towards Ukraine, there has been a heavy toll because Italy is very energy dependent on Russia. And that has created a shift in public opinion, of course, with aid towards Ukraine, because of the fact that it has a heavy economic toll with both with families and with businesses. Do you think that this economic toll on the country will affect the way that the Italian government will address and aid Ukraine over time? Will it worsen? And will the stance change towards Ukraine? Thank you.
So you all are such empowering and strong women. And I am just wondering, what did you do and how did you uphold such perseverance and poise in the hindrances and the obstacles that you talked about in the beginning? And what would you advise young women who want to take roles like you? Thank you.
Had a lot of the questions.
Since some of the questions were asked to me, so regional differences, you're right. Where is the student that asked that? There are regional differences in Italy. There has been historically a north-south issue. It's about development. It's about where you have your industrial base. In Italy, certainly much more in the north than in the south. But without wanting to escape the question, which is a real question, and the real question has also real answers. And for instance, after COVID, with our national recovery plan, 40% of the resources will be devoted to the south, precisely because we know that we have an issue there. But it's an issue for many of our countries. And by the way, it's also an issue for this country. We all have in every country a north and the south. It's an issue of rebalancing wealth in a country, trying to address differences that very often are based on historical conditions. It's about being very aware and putting resources on that. So we are doing that. I believe in the European Union, we identify also regions that are more vulnerable. Certainly the south of Italy it is. There are some regions in Greece, in Portugal, in Spain, in Ireland. I mean, there are areas where we still have an issue of equal development, if you want, economic development, but we are addressing that. The question on Ukraine and energy dependence and how much the consequences of the conflict of Ukraine can have an impact on the support to Ukraine. So first of all, let me tell you, this gives me the opportunity to go back to something that we discussed before about our dependency. One big lesson that we all learned, and some countries even more, like mine, you cannot be dependent from one other country for what you need the most, like in the case of energy. So Italy, as other European countries, was dependent from Russian gas for 40% of its needs. Right now, after 1 year, we put it down to 15%, which is a lot, believe me. And how we did it? We did it basically by reviving and increasing a lot of the relation that we have with friends country in the south, in Africa, in Northern Africa, in the Gulf, in Central Asia. So we diversified really very, 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 very quickly. And right now, and of course also the US and LNG, we tripled our import of LNG from the US in a year. Europe, I think doubled the how do you say, the supply from the US of LNG. So we all did this. In the case of my country, this was particularly challenging. I think we are in a much better position. And you see the result. The result are energy prices that are going down, not only for us, I mean, the result in the European Union. Energy prices are going down, still high, but going down. The big challenge remain inflation for all of us. I think we are, the last estimate of this morning are 8.5% of inflation rate in Europe is still too high. So what impact this has on people? It has an impact. And if you relate your inflation only to the crisis in Ukraine, yes, it can have an impact also on the support that people are right now giving to continue to help Ukraine defend itself. But I have to say that on a principled base, our population in Italy, and I think I can talk for every country in Europe, still believes that we need to continue to support Ukraine until it's necessary. And certainly this is the policy of the government. So the government will be doing whatever is necessary to keep that consensus not winning. But, you know, you opened the New York Times this morning and this administration has a problem with support by American people to continue to support Ukraine. So we all have that issue that sooner or later we will have to address.
Just maybe a comment on this, because I think it's very interesting with Mariangela. It's true that Italy was dependent on Russian gas, but so was most of Europe. And again, incredible numbers when you've seen what's happened over the past year. We didn't even think we could transition that quickly. You went to 15%. I think the European average is actually, we went from 42% to about 7% now, dependency on Russian gas. So that's incredible. In my own country, there's of course, there's of course been the new providers, as was also being mentioned. There's also been, of course, the whole accelerating transition into renewable energy in my country, because that's been another actually positive factor of all of this horrible situation is the focus on energy efficiency. Many countries have really been able to just save more energy, because the cheapest energy is obviously the one you don't even use. That's something we've seen a lot of very creative solutions for over this past year. In my own country, we managed to reduce our consumption of Russian gas with 30% and then increase our use of wind energy by 30%. Meaning that we now have about 52% of our electricity is now just from wind power. And actually 85% from renewable more generally. So there's also an acceleration of that, and just again, incredible how Europe has reacted in all of this and quickly transitioning into other energy sources. So I think that's been really positive. And that's, of course, one of the reasons to why we don't want to be dependent on in other fields, also one particular country. We've certainly learned that lesson. And listen, I mean, nobody, right now we're in a war. There's a war in Europe. And it's in challenging everything we stand for. So the focus is Russia from our side, but it doesn't mean that we forget about other long-term challenges. And if you see the change of NATO strategic concept last summer, you saw China mentioned for the first time. So I think that partly responds to your answer. And just on the last question, thank you so much. I think it's actually heartening to hear this thing, because we don't always, at least I can speak personally, feel that strong, but that's part of what you learn to do over the years, because there is certainly more women are challenged more in their careers. We've talked about that. There are also more attacks. We've talked about not so much today, but obviously when we see social media, women leaders and decision makers are just much more exposed than others. And you sort of you try to overcome these kind of things, and then you pick yourself up and put the pieces together in the evening, and that's part of it, and it shouldn't be like that. But I think that's just something everybody realizes. But lots of positive developments over there. And when I see now resumes from younger women, when we hire in the foreign ministry, I have to see everybody's qualified, of course, but the women are just very qualified, super well educated, super hardworking, and then there's a passion that is really encouraging to see for what they do. And if you don't have the passion in your work, you're never going to be good at it anyway.
Gosh, I would like to thank, would you want to? Oh, absolutely.
Very, very quickly, because I think the old gentleman who asked about China and whether that was the greatest threat that we face. I'd say to you, the greatest threat we face are existential ones. Climate crisis, we didn't get a chance to discuss today. The nuclear threat. Those of you who watched the Doomsday Clock lately, and if you didn't, have a look at it. Terrifying threats that are out there. Of course, we spoke about China, we spoke about Ukraine. They're very real challenges to us, and but I think that we need to also keep in mind those very big challenges where EU-US cooperation is fundamental to solving them. And to say thank you also to the young woman who talked about poise and persistence, both of which are needed. I'd say two things to that. One, what made a difference to me, I think perspective, the other P in the list. I think if you listen to all three of us, we all brought a perspective that was frankly wider than a career perspective. Our families, our partners, our children have taken a big role in the approach we have taken to diplomacy. And I think that's, I would advocate that you remember this, the lens can be very wide. And secondly, I would say to you, always true to yourself. The more women who are in our career, you'll see the more authentic you can be. I'm the proud ambassador of my small hometown. I never left the hometown in my head, even if I'm in Washington. Drogheda County Louth, for those who don't know my hometown. But it's something that I believe is important, that you remember why you're doing your job and where you came from.
Well, that's a lovely way of thinking about it. I'd like to get everybody to thank our three ambassadors here. This was a wonderful discussion, both foreign policy, international relations, and also women in diplomacy. And I will say we are called a School of International Service for a reason. And I would like to ask all of you, we have some coffee and probably cookies outside if you would like to go outside and have some refreshments. I do want to thank the ambassadors and say we will have another event on the 21st with another ambassador up close, and then something closer to my heart. We're having a 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement on March 21st, an all-day event. And that's something, as a citizen of both Britain and Ireland, it's very close to my heart. So I hope you will think about registering for that event as well. Thank you to the ambassadors for such a stimulating discussion.
Everybody, I was gonna say, that's why we're doing that. That's the same thing. So nice to meet you.